So we are down in the last chapter here of 2 Timothy, over here in chapter 4. We're going to be picking up in verse 6. We left off, finishing off verse 5, but we kind of want to tie things in here a little bit because verse 6 and 7 are verses you could just really read over those 6, 7, and 8 there very quickly, and you'd say, boy, those are pretty words, but you'd miss a lot. And as we go through 2 Timothy, we said from the very beginning of the book, and here as we close out the book, it is just as true and just as important. This is Paul's death letter. It is his letter to his most favorite person as far as we can tell on the planet, the man he felt closest to, the man that he viewed as his child in the faith, and really the guy who was going to carry on the torch when he was gone. And whenever Paul had a problem that he couldn't handle, Timothy was the first guy that he would call on and say, Timothy, I need you to go over here or go over there. He'd left him at this time. Timothy is in Ephesus and taking care of the brethren there and taking care of the church and dealing with all sorts of struggles in a place that Paul really had spent a lot of time and had spent over 2 years preaching in Ephesus, and a lot of things had happened there. And so when he couldn't be there, Timothy was the guy that he left. And now here's Paul. He's in his second Roman imprisonment, but this one is very drastically different than the previous. A dark prison cell, awaiting his death sentence, not in really a shameful position. I mean, you think about it. What do you think of people who are on death row? If I asked you, hey, would you like to go and visit somebody on death row? Do you think you'd have fun? No, you wouldn't want to go, would you? I mean, I've been to the prison, and I haven't been to the death row section, but I've been to the prison here, and you don't want to go there anyways, even just to visit. And so here's Paul, very much alone. He'll talk further on down how people had left him. People that Paul had trusted and considered his friends had departed and left him when he was in chains. And Timothy hadn't. And Paul is looking at his life right down here near the end. A man who'd seen shipwrecks, a man who'd been stoned and left for dead. He had been beaten. He'd had people who he considered close friends betray him. He'd just seen really some of the worst things that life could throw out. And here's Paul at the end, and in the verse previous, down in verse 5 of this chapter, we finished off, and he told Timothy, he says, but you be sober in all things, endure hardship, and do the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry. His message to Timothy, as Paul had just got done telling him, I've seen tough times, Paul had, and the church has a lot of really hard times ahead of it. You're going to see divisions, you're going to see false teachers, you're going to see lots and lots of struggles. But Timothy, don't give up hope. You do the work of an evangelist. This is the right thing to do with your life. So he's appealing as he nears the end of his life to Timothy to carry that torch. Keep on doing what God would have you to do. And we can't emphasize enough that this book, that is the essence of this book. That as you go through life as a Christian, you're going to have lots of ups and downs. You're going to have people who, outside of the church, despise you for your beliefs. You're going to have people inside of the church that let you down and betray you. You're going to have a lot of trials. There's going to be doctrinal things that come through the church, and you're going to have to stand firm while you see your friends fall by the wayside. And what Paul says is, having been through all of those things himself, he says, Timothy, it's still worth it. That he's speaking from the end of the journey. See, we look at it from the beginning, And I guess you could compare it to a lot of things. I mean, just about everything in life could be viewed this way. If you knew all the things that would be involved with parenting and all the struggles you were going to have with kids before you had the kids, you knew every single heartache they were going to give you, every single trial, how many people would have children? None of them would have them. But then you go through it, you don't know it up ahead. You know you'll have hard times, but you think, oh, I'll have good times too, and you do. And you go through it, and you look back on it, and you say, there's a great joy there. Now, that's what Paul is saying is, Paul did not know up front what he was going to have to suffer for becoming a Christian. God knew, but he didn't. In fact, go look over in Acts chapter 9 with me for just a second here. Go back to the beginning of Paul's life. In Acts 9, this is where you see that conversion story of Paul. And he was on that road to Damascus, and that great light shone. And then he's there in the city, and Jesus speaks to Ananias, says, I need you to go and speak to Saul. And Ananias doesn't want to do it. And down in verse 15, we get a little hint of what Paul's life was going to be like. It says, the Lord said to him, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. This is Paul. Paul's a chosen instrument. And look at what it says in verse 16. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. Now, Paul, at the very beginning here, when Ananias is told, I'm going to show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake, for the name of Christ. Paul didn't know what he was going to have to suffer yet. But now you go over to 2 Timothy here, and Paul does know, doesn't he? See, he's now lived that life. He's seen that pain. He's seen that heartache. He's seen and bears the marks of it on his body. And with all of that experience, he writes this final letter to his beloved child in the faith, Timothy, and says, do the work of an evangelist. You keep going. It is a life worth living. Now that should strike a chord in every one of our hearts, because you will have dark days, and you will have days where you will learn how much you must suffer for the name of the Lord. That there will be times where you make choices to be faithful that will cost you dearly. But Paul says, having been through all he'd been, do the work. Stick to it. It's worth it. And so he starts with that, and then in verse 6, verse 5 is, you could put it this way, verse 5 is, Timothy, this is what I want for you. Timothy, do the work. Fulfill your ministry. Fight that good fight. Do what you are here to do. And then in verse 6, 7, and 8, what he's going to do is tell Timothy, this is how I view my life. Now, Timothy, you could see, if you've ever had a loved one who was really sick in the hospital or something like that, or going through some very difficult times, you know that pain of when you can't help somebody. You know what it is? You would love to take that burden off of them, but you just can't do it. It's just not possible. Timothy would be in that circumstance here, wouldn't he? Here's Paul. He's in prison. He's awaiting death. What can Timothy do about it? Not a thing. So you can think how he would be churning over this, how this would affect him, because it's the way it affects all of us when we have people that we love who are hurting and we can't take their pain away. So what Paul's going to do here in verse 6, 7, and 8 is say, Timothy, I don't need you to take my pain away. Timothy, it isn't actually a pain at all. I am just fine. Don't you worry about me. Now, if you were watching a movie and they'll make movies like this where the spouse is dying or the beloved mother is dying, and then there's that deathbed scene, isn't there? And in the deathbed scene, what do they always have? It's okay, I'm going. It's okay, live your life. That's what these verses are. These are Paul telling Timothy, I've lived my time here, and I'm okay with what is ahead. Now, as we go through these verses, I don't want you to just read them. We're going to read 6, 7, 8, and then we're going to go back and break them down. But I don't want you to just kind of shoot through it. I want you to see this as that goodbye scene. This is Paul saying to Timothy, don't worry about me. Don't worry about what's going to happen to me. I'm okay with it. I've made my peace. I'm okay, and I'm going to be with God. I've got a better thing that awaits me. So now, with that in mind, let's read 6, 7, and 8. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved His appearing. Now this is Paul's goodbye. This is his, Timothy, don't you worry about it. And he starts out by saying, I'm about to be poured out as a drink offering. Now, drink offering means very, very little to you and I, because you have never offered a drink offering even once in your life. A drink offering was something a Jew did. Drink offering was a type of sacrifice, and so Paul is making an allusion to an Old Testament concept. And so in order to understand what he's saying, you have to have some Old Testament behind you. And so what we're going to do is just take a second to talk about what is a drink offering. When Paul says, I'm being poured out like a drink offering. My life is a drink offering to God. And I'm okay with that. What on earth does he even mean? Well, a drink offering is an interesting thing that you see throughout the Old Testament and the Old Law. And drink offerings were never offered really by themselves. A drink offering was never something that was given on its own. It was always meant to go over and on top of another sacrifice. Every time you read about it, it was given on top of something else. It was supplemental. And so Paul, I think it's over in Philippians, talks about the fact that if he is poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of the saints, he's okay with that. And so Paul, when he talks about a drink offering, he's not saying, I'm being poured out as the great sacrifice. In fact, Paul's talked so many times through this book and others, what is the great sacrifice? It's Jesus, isn't it? Jesus is the great sacrifice. God's already paid the price. And Paul has said, if I can fulfill in my body, fill up the sacrifices of Christ. In other words, if I can continue Christ's work with my life so that it gets to people that they can hear of Jesus and what He did, that's great. And so Paul says, I'm a drink offering. I'm being offered on top. Philippians 2:17, yea, if I am offered upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I joy and rejoice with you all. So Paul says, if I can just be, I guess you'd think of a drink offering, we might use the saying, a cherry on top. You know, the cherry on top is not the sundae, is it? But it's awfully nice. You kind of like that little thing. I look forward to it at the end of the sundae. That's kind of what a drink offering is. And so Paul is saying, if my life can even be if it can just be a garnish on the work Christ has done here, I'm a happy man. If you think of a sacrifice, this big bull being offered as a sacrifice, a ram or a lamb being offered as a burnt offering, and then they pour that drink offering of typically wine over the top of it, the wine isn't the main thing. It's just kind of the extra dressing on the sacrifice. And that's what Paul's saying is, my life, I've lived my whole life so that I could be poured out like a garnish, just a little extra. If I could be somehow intermingled with what Christ has done, if I could be associated with His offering. I mean, you think about it, if you were a Jew and you saw somebody bring a lamb up, they slit the lamb's throat, and they put the lamb and they burn the lamb, and then they pour the wine over on top of it, and somebody asked you, what did they just sacrifice? Would you say the wine? What would everybody say? They would say, no, they just sacrificed a lamb. The drink offering wouldn't really even be thought of. It's just kind of over the top. And Paul's saying, that's what I am. I am being poured out like an offering to God that even if nobody ever remembers it, it was still a life well lived. Drink offerings were really positive. They weren't associated with negative things. As you read through the Scriptures and all the various accounts where drink offerings come up, they're associated with feasts and free will offerings. A free will offering was when somebody was just happy, somebody was just thankful, and they'd give a gift to God. They'd make an extra sacrifice. They weren't required to. It was just a voluntary extra one. They were associated with the continual offerings, the morning and the evening, the Passover lamb, things like that, Sabbath offerings. These are the things drink offerings were associated with. You associated drink offerings with an offering to God of a positive nature. Not I made this horrible mistake offering. See, there are sin offerings too that the Bible talks a lot about, that they made all the time. A man would sin, the nation would sin, they'd make sacrifices to God. That's not what drink offerings are associated with. Drink offerings are associated with things like the feast of the Passover. Well, what's the Passover about? Why do you have the feast of the Passover? It's because God passed over them in Egypt. It was a positive thing, how God saved us. Or the first fruits of the harvest, where God had provided crops another year. Or somebody would offer a free will offering. Something wonderful had happened in their life and they wanted to give thanks to God. That's what you associated drink offerings with. And so when Paul says, I'm being poured out as a drink offering, he's using this comparison that's a positive one. My life is associated with happy times. Now I want you to think about that for a second. Once again, we've said it before, where is Paul right now? He's in prison. He's awaiting death at the hands of pagan men for crimes that he has not committed. He's an innocent man. And he says, I think of my departure as one of a happy time. Yeah. Celebrate's a good word. Yeah, you're getting the feel of it. That celebrate is the idea. These are feasts. The feasts were times of celebration, times of joy, times of thanksgiving. That's what you would associate a drink offering with. And so Paul is saying here, as I face death, I'm not dying a sad man. I'm not dying a man who looks back and regrets a whole lot in his life. I am dying as a man who is going to meet God and is thankful for the life I've been given and the hope that I have that awaits me. It's really a powerful thing. Genesis 35:14 is the very first recorded example of a drink offering. A lot of times you can understand what something is and its definition by looking at the very first time it shows up. The very first time a drink offering ever shows up is actually even before the law of Moses, and it was Jacob. And Jacob, he went and he poured out this drink offering because God had fulfilled his promises to him. And when Jacob had all these things happen to him, all these things he'd been through in life, here it is, and his brother, and then Laban, and all these things. And then after that, he's bringing his family out, and things are good. He goes back to this place where he'd had that vision of the angels ascending and descending, and he goes back right there, and he made a drink offering to God amongst the other sacrifices. So it's associated there in Genesis 35 with fulfilled promises. Look at God, what you did. You fulfilled your promises to me. And so really what you're looking at with life, with Paul here, is Paul saying, I'm being poured out as a drink offering. My life is over. It's fulfilled. I've completed my task here, my journey, and I'm happy. As Denise said, I'm celebrating. I'm thankful. I'm grateful. I have no regrets about my life. I can look back and say, I am a happy man as I face God. Now, isn't that the way you want to die? See, I'd rather die in a prison cell like Paul, with Paul's outlook on the future, than die in a mansion regretting the choices I made to get there. And so Paul really gives us a big lesson in that statement, a drink offering. I'm being poured out as a drink offering. It's my life was a life well lived, and I'm happy to go to meet my Maker because I'm associated with something bigger than myself. And I'm pleased with the life I live. Anybody have any comments or questions on that? Okay. So then he says, and the time of my departure has come. In other words, the departure he's talking about there is his death. And that also tells you something, doesn't it? The time of my departure has come. You know, when somebody says, I'm about ready to depart, do you think, what do you think of somebody? I'm going on a journey. Oh, where are you going? Right? Oh, I've got to depart. I've got a departure in the morning. Oh, where are you flying to? What are you going to go see? See, Paul uses that language for a reason. The Holy Spirit put that language down there in that way for a reason, didn't He? So that you and I would think, when I die, what is it? It's not all over, is it? It's a departure. You know, I'm going somewhere. I'm going to meet God. And so Paul, as he looked at his life, he says, I'm just departing. You know, they're gonna put my body to death here, but what's going to happen to my spirit? It's going to depart, and it's going to go on a journey that I can't take my body with. So I'm ready for that day. And then he says in verse 7, he says, I have fought the good fight. Now that comes from the term of boxing or wrestling. It has the idea of a contest and a battle between two people. If you have a boxing match, can you have a boxing match with one person? It's just absolutely impossible. You can't have a contest with one person. And it's interesting that he puts it that way. He's fought the fight. Well, who's Paul been fighting? He's been fighting the devil, hadn't he? He's been fighting against sin. He's been fighting against the evil, the powers of this world. And he says, I've fought the good fight. You know, I've gone out and I've fought my battles, and I have the war wounds on my body. And I can say I have done that which was right. When you think about the idea of fighting, probably for me, one of the things that always sticks in my mind is there was a saying that the women of Sparta had. And it was, as their husbands went off to war, the Spartans were known for fighting. That's what they were. That was their whole culture, was just to fight. And they had a saying. They said, either come home alive or come home on your shield. Because that was what they would do. They'd carry them on their shield. In other words, you're dead. Come home either alive, having fought a valiant battle, or come home having died in that battle and died a warrior's death. And that meant a lot to them. It was the worst thing you could possibly have as a Spartan would be to be a coward. That was the most shameful and horrible thing that could happen. Here Paul says, I fought the good fight. I got wounds. The enemy's going to put my body to death here at the end, but I wasn't a coward. I lived boldly for the Lord. I was brave. Remember him telling Timothy, don't have that spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. That's really that idea of fighting the good fight. There's a contest, there's a battle, there's a war on. And will we stand for it, or will we be cowards? And I look at times in my life, and I want to make sure that I am fighting that fight, and I'm not wasting opportunities, and I'm not shirking from responsibilities because I'm scared or because it makes me uncomfortable. So he says, I fought the good fight, and then he says, I have finished the course. The course, this is the idea of running a race. And as Paul looked at it, he says, here it is, I run, and I run, and I run, and I run, but I'm going to cross that finish line someday. And we need to think the same thing. Death for a Christian is the finish line. It is the success. If somebody runs, if you have a 1 mile race and the guy runs 7/8 of a mile and stops, it's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. There's no value to the race unless he finishes it. And Paul says, I ran strong. And I ran through the tape. I didn't give up. And I can look back and feel good about the life I've lived. And then he says, I have kept the faith. The faith here in this context is the gospel. We each try and be faithful and have faith in God, but the faith is the book in which we learn about faith from. It's the Word of God. And Paul says, I've kept it. I've held on to it. I didn't let go of it. See, at the end of your life, what other people think of you will not matter. If at the end of your life you can look and you say, I did my very best to cling tightly to this book. I treasured it. When I saw its commandments, I valued them. I tried to live by them. When I fell down, I got back up again and I tried it again. If you can say, I've kept the faith, I never let go of it. I never gave up and said it's too hard. I never got to the point where I said, well, it's not worth the effort. I never got so proud that I had more of a love for myself than I did for the Lord. I've kept the faith. That's what Paul says. That's a life well lived. And so as you look at it, look at the power of the language he's using there. I've fought the good fight. I've finished the course. I've kept the faith. That idea of guarding that which has been entrusted to him. As you look at that language Paul's using, it's picturesque for a reason. He's really trying to get across a concept to Timothy. Anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, so 2 Timothy chapter 4, now down in verse 8. He says, in the future, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. And what Paul does is two things here. He says, this is what I'm looking forward to, and then he says, you can look forward to it as well. That's that point where he says, not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. He says, there will come a time when Christ is on that day of judgment, when Christ comes, there's something that's going to happen to me, and it's not just happening to me because I'm an apostle. See, if Paul hadn't said that second part, you could say, well, that happens to apostles, but it doesn't happen to the rest of us. What does he say, though? Not just me, but to all who've loved his appearing. And he says, this is what is there. He says, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. Now, this language would have meant a lot. He's been using a lot of athletic analogies here. And this is another one. When an athlete won, they would give him this crown, and it was what we think of as a wreath that they would wear. And this is actually a picture from the Olympic Games in Greece, and they mimicked that by, once again, when everybody won at the Olympics and you went and stood on the podium and everything, they gave them a crown. And so what Paul is talking about here is not a crown of, we think of a kingly crown. That's not what he's talking about. This is a victor's crown. This is a crown of he who has fought and won. Fought the fight and won. Ran the race and finished. That sort of thing. And so when you think about it, here it is. Here's Paul. And he's saying, I've got a crown that's laid up for me. Well, when you lay something up, we use this kind of language with the contribution. What are you supposed to do? We pass the plate first day of the week. 1 Corinthians 16 talks about first day of the week when you come together, we're to take up a collection. And each of you should lay by in store for that collection. What does that mean? Does that mean when the plate comes, you just kind of fish in your pockets? Do I have $1 here? Do I have a quarter? No, it's supposed to be done ahead of time, isn't it? Laying something up ahead of time means it's already reserved. Now, I want you to imagine for a second, here's Paul, and Paul says, there is already reserved for me. I just got to go get it. There is reserved for me a crown, and it's a victor's crown. It's the one you give to a champion. And Paul says that's laid up for you as well. Isn't that exciting to think about? That right now, Right now, God is just waiting. All He wants to do, there's nothing that gives Him greater joy than to have reserved for you a victor's crown. And all you got to do is go get it. If you love me, if you have faith in Christ, if you'll live by Christ and make Him your master, He says, I'll pay the price for you to have that victor's crown. I'll pay the price for you to have that victory. You just got to come and get it. And that's the way Paul views it. He says, I have a crown waiting for me. And these athletes, they get a crown. Oh, I ran a mile in 4 minutes. Or this guy said, well, I threw a discus this far. And they get a crown. And somebody said, well, what's that crown for? That crown's because I could throw a discus, 200 feet. What's our crown for? He says it's a crown of righteousness. There is laid up for me, Paul says, a crown that I can wear, and when I wear it, people will say, there is a righteous man. There is a man who's right with God. Doesn't that give you goosebumps, the thought of that? Here is something that is waiting for us if we'll just go and get it. There's a crown of righteousness. So you think about the honor and the joy and that sense of satisfaction when you have an athlete and they competed in the Olympics. Their whole life has been around this, and then they get to stand on that podium. And they go and they stand on that podium, and the judges come up, and the judges, they award them their medal, their crown. Well, who's going to do that for us? There's going to come a judgment day. Hebrews 9:27 says that it's appointed for a man to die once and then the judgment. There's a judgment that awaits us. And on that day of judgment, it says, the Lord, the righteous judge, will award us the crown. It's not going to be some minion who does it. It's not even going to be some angel who comes and says, okay, here's your crown. Who's awarding you the crown? The Lord. Paul says, that's what awaits me. That's why I fight the good fight. That's why I finished the course. That's why I've kept the faith. Because I keep thinking about that crown. That's what I want. And so, of course, as you look at this, this is the essence of life, isn't it? You can see why, as Paul gets to the end of his letter to Timothy, this is right near the end. Isn't this the important stuff? This is what life's about. You just blow all the rest of it away. No matter what happens to you here, if at the end of your life, God says, well done, good and faithful servant. And He puts that crown on your head, that imperishable crown, and you're marked as a righteous person for eternity. One whom God has blessed. One who is right before God. That's it. That's what it's all about. And so Paul really is emphasizing there with Timothy, this is why I'm okay. Don't worry about me, Timothy. I'm going to a far better place. Remember what he told the Philippians? He says, to live is Christ and to die is gain. I got a gain coming. Don't you worry about it, Timothy. I'm fine. And in fact, I'm so excited about where I'm going, I want to tell you about it because I want you to go there too. I want you to go get your crown. Now, the Lord put that in there. Not just for Timothy. He put it in there for us. He wants you to get your crown. He wants you to have that joy as well, so that on the day of judgment, you will be awarded with that crown of righteousness that He has laid up for those who love His appearing. Anybody have any comments or questions? Yeah, Todd?
Can you explain love is appearing a little bit? I don't really understand.
Okay. Imagine it this way. So what we're talking about is the day of judgment right now. On that last day, on that day, I'm going to get a crown. And what we're told on the day of judgment, Jesus is going to come back. Acts 1:11, I think it's 1:11. When Jesus ascended, the angel said He'll return in the same like manner in which He left. Okay, so when Christ comes, He's going to come down through the clouds. We're all going to see Him. And there's going to be two reactions to that. There's going to be people who see Jesus return, and everybody's going to bend their knee. But they're going to bend their knee and cower in fear. oh no, what did I do? There's going to be that weeping and gnashing of teeth. Paul's saying it's those people who've lived their life so that when Christ comes back, they go, yes, that's it.
Well, I guess just looking at the text there, have, like it's already happened.
Oh, okay. Yeah, what he's doing is he's talking about,
Their future attitude.
that's right. He's saying here in that day, they will have loved his appearing. Does that make sense? Yeah, so you're right, it's a past tense, but it's a case where he's thrown the past tense into the future. Does that answer the question for you? Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, now let's go down and we're going to hit now verse 9, and this section will go a lot faster. We're going to finish the class tonight. Now these are kind of closing comments. These are things where Paul is just simply covering details that are, really primarily would be things he'd want Timothy to know. They're housekeeping sorts of things would be the way I'd think of it. So in verse 9 he says, make every effort to come to me soon. We never know whether Timothy actually made it. He says, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Now think about that for a second, what that actually means. Here was a guy who had been with Paul, been supporting Paul, and then when things got real tough, what did he do? He booked it out of there. Imagine how that would make a guy like Paul feel. That's an extra wound as the man sitting there in prison. So he says, if you can come, come. For Demas has loved this present world, and he's deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Now, he's not speaking ill of these two guys. He's just simply saying they're not here. Now, Demas, he left because he loved this world instead of the Lord. These two guys, they're in different places and for other reasons. So it's not necessarily a negative connotation with them. It says, only Luke is with me. Now, this is the Luke who wrote the Gospel of Luke. He wrote the book of Acts. He's the Luke who's the doctor, the physician. And so here he says, I have Luke with me. And then he says an interesting thing. And this is just one of those small little details, but it's a powerful detail. He says, pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. Now, this Mark here is John Mark. This is the guy that Paul, over in Acts chapter 15, split with Barnabas over. Barnabas and Paul had taken John Mark with them on their very first journey. And then, when they got to Paphos, Mark left. It never tells us why he left, but it does tell us that Paul was not happy with why he left. And so when they went to go on another journey, Barnabas wanted to take Mark, and Paul didn't want to do it. He didn't think he was the right guy for the job. And they fought over it so vigorously that they each went their own way. Barnabas went over to Crete. Paul went over the top and visited Derbe and Lystra. And they went separate ways. And Paul took Silas with him, and Barnabas took Mark with him. Now, you can imagine, that was a pretty bad split to split those two guys. And at the time, you look at that and you say, boy, could they ever mend those fences? Well, look at what you see here. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. Well, that tells you a couple of things. One, fences were mended. And Paul either had been wrong about Mark, in which case he's saying, I was wrong, Mark's a good guy, I can use him, I've learned my lesson. Or he was right about Mark, but Mark changed. And Mark became somebody who was useful. Or a mix of the two. Yeah.
Does this request, which would take some time to fulfill, plus the ministering that he expected to get from Mark, he would put some kind of time aside?
Right.
So does this kind of imply that Paul isn't thinking he's going to die tomorrow or real immediately?
Yes, I think so. I think, it's obviously the rest of the letter that Paul he just says, my departure is at hand. I mean, it's coming. But, yeah, I think what you're looking at is he seemed to at least think he had enough time for maybe Timothy and Mark to come. But he does tell him, he says, make every effort to come soon. In other words, I don't think I've got a lot of time here, But if you get this letter, so imagine him writing the letter, the amount of time it took to get to Timothy. So yes, there would have been, a time of, I would count in maybe months, where he would think that maybe he still had time. So yes, I think you're right. Let's see here. But Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus, and when you come, bring the cloak which I left at Troas with Carpus, and the books, especially the parchments. So here, here's some things I could use these. And then he says, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. Now, we don't know which Alexander this is. It may be an Alexander that's already mentioned in the Bible. There was an Alexander in Ephesus that this may be. Or it may be an Alexander we just know nothing about, but he felt compelled to warn Timothy. Here's this guy, and don't trust him. He's done me a lot of harm in the past, and he's opposed our teaching. Down verse 16, he says, at my first offense no one supported me, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. So here's Paul, and he says, when I first went to court, when I first went up before all these things, he says, just everybody left me. But what is Paul saying? Don't let it be counted against him. What did Paul do? He forgave him. It's another kind of element of somebody nearing death, isn't it? What is one of the things we see over and over and over again in the Bible is the power and the necessity of forgiveness. Don't count it against him. Don't count it against him. And so, Paul, you see that forgiving heart there. And then he says, verse 17, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me. So everybody else deserted me, but was I alone? No, the Lord stood with me and strengthened me so that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished and that all the Gentiles might hear, and I was rescued out of the lion's mouth. Now he's talking about a previous time here where he'd been rescued. And out of the lion's mouth there is, he's most likely referring to the Colosseum lions, because that's what they did with the Christians. That's what they did with people that they condemned. They'd take them out of the Colosseum, let the lions loose, and everybody got some entertainment out of the whole thing. He says, the Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. Now, here, Paul's already said before, what is the kingdom? If you had to say it in one word, what's the kingdom? You said it, Mitch. It's the church. The kingdom's the church. But now here Paul says, he'll bring me to his heavenly kingdom. Well, Paul's already in the kingdom, but what's he not in? The heavenly kingdom. Now what I mean by that is, there is a difference between the church here now and the church in eternity, isn't there? Right now you're in the kingdom. Colossians 1 says that you've been transferred into the kingdom of the Son of His love, but you're waiting for the day when that kingdom is the heavenly kingdom, and you're going to be brought safely into it. Yeah.
That kind of be the same thing as in like the Lord's Prayer in the Gospels, where He says, "Your will be done on earth
as it is in heaven."
Doing what you're doing until it's all together.
All fulfilled. Yeah, it's that sense of you're waiting to that time when you get to heaven and everything's the way it ought to be. Yeah. I think that's the same concept. Yeah. And so to Him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Priscilla and Aquila are that couple that Paul was with there in Corinth and Ephesus. And he had been a tent maker with them, and so he had a great relationship, so say hi to them. Erastus remained at Corinth, but Trophimus I left sick at Miletus. Make every effort to come before winter. So there's that sense of urgency again. But as Gene pointed out, you've got that sense of he thinks he has some time, but probably this might answer it a little bit. He thinks he has until about winter, would be one way to put it. Eubulus greets you, also Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brethren. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you. And thus closes 2 Timothy, one of the most heartfelt letters in all of the New Testament. Anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, we'll stop there.